Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here for this Artist Roundtable, the first of two this morning. My name is David Scott, and I'm very, very privileged to be here as part of the biennial programming. And what we want to do this morning in this panel and the one that follows is to participate in the stimulation of a conversation about art and its social life. Let me tell you perhaps a little bit about where I'm coming from with the kinds of questions that I want to raise. These are questions that, for me, anyway, grow out of the 2.5, I suppose, decades of the work with the Small Axe Project. And in that project, where the visual arts are concerned, indeed where arts of any sort are concerned, what we are interested in is the relationship between artistic practice, representational practice more broadly, and the social worlds in which that representational or artistic practice takes place. So I'm interested inside of the Small Axe practice in the relationship between art and its function in society, whether or to what extent one can talk about art as having a critical function, whether one should or can talk about a distinction between art and its individual life in relation to the artist who produces the work, art and its social life in relation to the living organism of the community in which the art is produced and circulates. So I want to stimulate here among these amazing artists around me a conversation of this sort. What is the relationship between art and the histories that inform the art? What is the relationship between art and the political order in which art is produced? We heard yesterday in some of the opening speeches that art ought to be connected to the development project of the state in which we live and in which art is produced. How do artists think about their role in relation to the state? Should art be beneficial to the state? Should the state be able to frame the kinds of art that artists produce? Should the state be able to sanction or not the art that artists produce? What is the role of the institutions of the state that enable or that produce a framework in which what constitutes the national in relation to art is exhibited to the society in which art is produced and art circulates? Now, these, I think anyway, are hard questions, and they are not by any means questions that have any fixed answer. Presumably, these are questions that shift depending on the social, political, and cultural lives in which art is being produced. I also want to raise the question, which was important to the biennial thinking, about the relationship between artists who live and work in Jamaica and artists who think of themselves as Jamaican, who live and produce elsewhere. Now, this is a hard question, of course, as we know, because of the relationship between people who live in Jamaica itself and people who live outside of Jamaica. And that's a tough, complicated relationship, especially for people whose inspiration, wherever they are, remains connected to the historical, cultural, political worlds from which they come. So the relationship between people who, whatever their ongoing interconnections are with the island state, is an ongoing and crucial question. So, with that preamble, I wanted to say a little bit about how I hope we might proceed here. This is completely impromptu and informal. We are all going to be polite and solicitous, but we want to try to give a voice to really the most important people here, who are the practitioners of visual production, the artists. So we want to hear from them. We have approximately 50 minutes, or maybe about 45 now, for a discussion amongst us. Or I think of myself here primarily as a facilitator, but hopefully we can have a conversation among the artists for about 45 to 50 minutes or so. And then we'll open it up to questions from the audience, and maybe there'll be questions from people who are listening online. And I will begin by simply asking each of you to introduce yourselves, and you're undoubtedly known, but just so that those, of course, who are not present but online will know who we are. And then I will begin by trying to provoke each of you questions, out of which a conversation, I hope, will emerge. Does that sound reasonable? So, shall we begin by just introductions one after the other? Laura, would you like to begin?
Hello, my name is Laura Facey, and I'm the author of Guide Their Way Home.
Thank you. Roberta?
Good morning. My name is Roberta Stoddart, and I am a painter, and I am the visual storyteller in the book, The Storyteller.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Katrina Coombs. I'm a fiber artist, an independent curator and educator.
Morning, everyone. My name is Phillip Thomas. I'm a painter, graduated from the Edna Manley College of the Visual and Performing Arts, where I also lecture, and I'm also very happy to be a part of this. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very much. So, so let me begin. The idea of pressure, to begin there, emerges precisely out of what I said at the beginning, how to connect visual practice to its social conditions. And to my mind, pressure is simply one commanding idiom in which to think about the challenges and that constitute a major part of the social and historical and cultural conditions of life in Jamaica. How do you, Laura, and I'm going to ask this of everyone, the same question basically, how do you think about the relationship between the social and historical and political conditions of life in Jamaica and your own visual practice? Anyone who glances at your work will feel the force of the history of Jamaica. How do you think about as a self-conscious way, or maybe as a not so self-conscious way, about the relationship between the social conditions of life?
And then you can breathe and let it go. So, you know, I've certainly grown up here in Jamaica, and I'm mixed, even though I may not look very mixed.
I first began to create work about my own pain. And I literally began to fall into the pain of the country. I think that's how it began for me. And then as my awareness broadened, little bit, I began to feel a responsibility, not just to my own pain, but to the pain I saw around me. And how to find a visual language was also something that didn't come from thinking. It came from simply doing the work, just applying myself day in, day out, whether I didn't feel like I wanted to or if I didn't feel confident about it, I would just try and work. And then you build a sort of muscle as a response to your own process, your own procedure. And as that responsibility began to grow, I realized this was so far beyond me. I mean, this was enormous, really. And, you know, it will never be, whatever I do will never feel like it's ever enough. And you just hope that in some way you've been as truthful as you can be to yourself and to your own journey and to what you've seen around you. So what I've tried to do is to only paint things that are absolutely meaningful to me. If it means something to me, it's because there's most likely a connection that's not always at first visible, and then I have to trust that intuition on it and just start creating. And that never happens overnight. That's a long process. For example, when I painted an exhibition almost entirely of some albino people people I met in Trinidad. That came after first thinking about it 5 years prior and wondering about it, but not to paint, just looking at an individual on a street corner and wondering what their life must be like. And then, a lot of the time my work has been about outsiders. As a gay person, that is also quite a journey to empathize with other people, not just my own, as I said, my own pain. But there are many traumatic histories, and anyway.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Robert. One of the things that you raise, which is clearly of enormous importance, and that I hope that we will be able to talk about, is the relationship between what we think of as individual pain and what we might think of as more broadly social pain, and how social suffering and individual suffering differently or connectedly inform the work of visual artists. And I hope that forms a part of the conversation that we have. We were chatting a little bit earlier on, and you were telling me something about your practice and about some of the wider features of your engagement as an artist. Can you respond to some of these questions, the relationship between your art form with fibers, and its relationship to the wider social life of the community that you reside in, intersect with, and or are trying to address? Why fiber? Why is fiber such a, why is fiber the material that gives life to your artistic imagination?
Thank you, Devin. I must say, though, Roberta, listening to you, hearing how you speak your truth through your work and how the work becomes the truth of you and the responsibility of the self, but then to others, I felt as if you were speaking my truth. And I think that's also within my own practice. It started out as me investigating my own independent issues of the self, issues of the I as a woman, coming up in society, attempting to identify and figure out just my role and who am I, in relation to the cultural appropriation of what a woman is expected to be or how she's expected to carry herself or the things that she's expected to do, and how that led me down a path of really realizing what my big issue was, which was loss. And then how that loss and investigating and interrogating loss for myself reflects back the loss of others. And then bringing that engagement now back into my work, whereas there's this responsibility, as Roberta said, in terms of your work now has a responsibility to feed the audience, feed the general public, because it is a reflection of them, it's a reflection of the self. And we all don't exist in our singular nutshell, but our relations and our experiences are reflective of each other as we are here within this space, within this time now, and things that may perhaps have been something of the past, or we think that we've moved forward from it. You take one step forward, it's almost like we're taking 2 steps back, in current day. And for me, the medium of textiles, the medium of fiber, it's just this very delicate medium that I think representative even of the woman, of the feminine, of the maternal structure. It is the object in which you're clothed in at birth. It replaces almost the womb. It's that sense of security and identity. And for me, using it as that medium to speak my truth and the truth of others, the truth of the woman, as I am only a woman, and I can really only reflect that which I have experienced. And the material allows me to dive into just that moment, the process of weaving, knitting. It becomes this spiritual process. It becomes this very cathartic, reflective, and healing process, of engaging the stories, of engaging the experiences, and allowing the work itself to just manifest it and become it.
Thank you very much. Katrina, I want to hang on one or two of the to my mind, very provocative terms that you use. Picking up, first of all, on Roberta's idea of responsibility, I think that's something that I hope we can open up into a wider discussion. To whom is the artist responsible? And one of the things that you seem to be suggesting is that the artist is responsible first and foremost to their own truth. And inside of that truth, which connects to my mind to the idea of pressure and its relationship to Jamaican social cultural history, is the idea of loss. The relationship between the artistic imagination and the evocation of an articulation of what that loss is, and how you share that sense of loss to a wider society. Thank you. Phillip. There is in your work too a sense of storytelling, I think, a relationship to narrative, but also a very strong figurative portraiture orientation. And I wonder whether you can talk to, there are very strong figures in your work. I wonder whether you can speak to the relationship between your artistic practice and the social life around you that lives inside of the work.
Well, if you've listened to what each artist talk about, the idea of loss and how that affects their work, I think being the only male artist up here today and having to hear about motherhood, femininity, the womb, and the idea of loss, and what the Supreme Court is doing in the United States of America. So you have to understand that the conversation is now taken into a particular direction because of not what's happening in the country of Jamaica, but what's happening globally, right? And so once you stop thinking about Jamaica as just an island state, but part of the global narrative, then each of these conversations become a global conversation. So for my work personally, I started really again with loss, but at the state level. So what I regard as maybe my first work where I felt like I really did something meaningful with my art was when, I don't know if any of you remember when the Brayton 7 killing happened. And I made a painting called Brayton 7. I was just graduating from the Edna Manley College. And that was 20 years, almost a quarter of a century. Think about that. and so that painting, in a way, opened my mind to what state art can mean. Not necessarily working for the government, but what state responsibility in art is, right? So on the one hand, what happened nationally with that tragedy is that, of course, when the state moves in and takes the life of the citizen, then naturally there is social outrage. But I also went into the community. Brayton is not that far from where I live. And when you go into the community and hear the individuals that know the people speak, it's actually a counter-narrative to the state response. And so I found myself making a painting that, in a way, had to sit between national outrage and another set of people who were like, good riddance. And so you have to negotiate this very sensitive situation, right? How do you hold the state accountable for loss of life? Yet, at the same time, there are difficulties within the sub-narrative of what's happening. And so that work, in a way, sparked this entire inquiry of what is the artist's responsibility at the state level. Now, my own contribution to this exhibition is a strange one because, as you know, I sort of shipped some work back from the States to be a part of it. And in thinking about the theme and thinking about what's happening globally, of course, with the invasion of Ukraine, and how even Jamaican students got involved in that. So again, the sort of global narrative, you're not just an island state, you're part of the entire narrative of the world. And so when I decided to use tank as a response to that tragedy, not a lot of people realize that tank was made before the invasion of Ukraine. And so I remember in an interview I did yesterday, I was asked, why is it that artists always seem to have a sense of what's about to happen in a way? Or how is it that artists sort of respond to a time whereby it seems to be prophetic? And I always respond in this way. It's not necessarily about being prophetic. It's really artists understanding how cycles function. And once an artist understands how cycles and human interaction functions, they're always able to create works that seem to resonate even in the future. It seems to continuously resonate as a part of the human experience. And so that's the way in which artists seem to appear prophetic, but not necessarily. So it's understanding human culture.
Thank you very much, Philip. I want to pick up on one of the things that you've said before, because in fact, one of the project that you did for Small Acts, in fact, emerged out of the same event that you're talking about. But you make a distinction between the artist responding to a demand for state accountability in violence, and also trying to find a voice with which to critique the wider question of social violence that is not necessarily state-driven violence, violence that grows out of social, economic, and other kinds of conditions. And so in some sense you suggest that the artist walks a fine line in trying to connect to and critique the social conditions in which art functions. The other thing that you raise, which is of course really very important, is the relationship between art and what constitutes its social condition. And you say, and you've said before, which I think is enormously important, which is that Jamaica is not an isolated island. Jamaica is a world, obviously, but it is also a world that's connected to a wider world, to a global world. And there's nothing in the global world that doesn't, in some ways, inflect conditions here that you respond to.
I raised that point because of some of the earlier narratives that you talked about in terms of the artist in Jamaica versus the artist abroad, and how does the practice develop based on both situations. I was actually reading through Nicole Smythe Johnson's essay, and she talked about how the practice of artists that are working in Jamaica as opposed to artists that are working abroad, and how, you know, the access to institution, state funding basically, how does that affect the trajectory of different artists' lives, success, whatever the case may be. I do have some disagreements with a lot of those points, actually. Because to set up the narrative that for artists who chose, and I want to use this word specifically, there are a lot of us who decided to be here, right? As opposed to people who decide to go off and find life elsewhere, which is not a critique on their decision. But if you stage the narrative in such a way whereby the artists who decided to stay home and build nation as a kind of making an uninformed decision, an ill-informed decision, I don't think that's a fair comparison, to be quite frank. And also, you know, it's a very complicated situation, because I can think of a dozen people who, had they not stayed in Jamaica, we wouldn't have the National Gallery to be showing works. We wouldn't have the Edna College, in which we are producing incredible artists every day. And so, there is a fine line between what it means to be an artist working in your own country, trying to develop your own community, as opposed to simply joining another one, right? And so those are some of the difficulties that artists tend to think about all the time. No, it is true that many of us, I mean, Katrina and myself, of course, as younger artists who are, really in the throes of practicing now, are really functioning across the planet. I mean, there's so many exhibitions that just between me and Katrina alone have been in all over the place, right here from Jamaica. It has nothing to do with uprooting or doing anything like that. If we truly believe in the concept of the global village, right? If that is a farce, then maybe the point is true. But if it is not a farce and we actually believe it, then one can stay anywhere and produce global art.
Thank you very much, Philip. Do either of you, Laura or Roberta, want to respond to any of what has been said on this side of me, or Katrina, do you want to respond further to what Roberta and Laura or what Philip has said, so we can get a conversation across me?
My only thought is that I do believe it's the job of the artist to be responsible for leading through our art, leading a way forward. I mean, that's our job. We are, going to come up. We are supposed to have the eyes to see further, to feel further. That's our job, and so I do believe we are responsible in that way. It's our job.
So, do you think that the artist has a social responsibility to lead?
Yes, I do.
And a social responsibility to lead that derives from what sources? Are those sources personal and individual sources, or are those sources political and cultural sources? Do those sources come from institutions, or do those sources come from an artistic intuition?
I can't divide them. I mean, Roberta's description of how she journeyed into her work and how she developed, shall we say, her muscle. I mean, again, just like Katrina said, I felt like that's exactly how it was for me. So I can't divide these different pockets. To me, everything is interconnected.
Thank you, Laura. Roberta, and both Roberta and Katrina have spoken very, very strongly about the relationship between gender and artistic production, and an articulation of womanhood and femininity, and Roberta, a question of the relationship between sexual orientation and artistic production. Can either or both of you talk a little bit about how loss, marginality, experience, personal experience of loss frames the way in which your work intervenes in a particular social order?
All right, for me, in investigating the self, investigating the I, really, there is the cultural relation in terms of how we nurture. And in terms of nurturing, how do we really associate or define the self? How do we define the self in relation to the other? And how do we constantly negotiate the I and the other? And in many circumstances, for me, the other has become an internal being, which is the womb. And we immediately disassociate once you're going through your cycle, or even sometimes within pregnancy. It's not I, it's this other thing that has invaded. But then no, that social relation that we have with everybody else. You become a different person to them during all of that process, whereas now there's this separation and segregation that we kind of do within the self, and attempting to find back the root. For me, it's been a journey of identifying back as to who I am, what I am, how do I coexist amongst everyone, but also how do they coexist amongst me, as well as noting that it is a universal experience that is linked here, and how do we define it here in Jamaica amongst ourselves versus that of other groups outside of Jamaica, and realizing that even though the conversations are different, they're very much the same. We may use different terms, but it is in that universal context that we can grow locally, even within the medium of textiles and fiber. My practice, I've always been asked, is it a cultural thing in Jamaica? Did I learn it from my grandmother or my mother? And each time I say no, but just attempting to see how this medium of textiles is very much present here, but not necessarily embraced. So it's always been this journey of just finding that center within society. And then I just wanted to piggyback on Phillip in terms of what he was saying earlier with the role of the artist, the role of being present in Jamaica, practicing in Jamaica versus overseas. And I think it's really an older approach, whereas there was this notion of if you need to make it, you have to go abroad. And I think now with technology evolving, and it's so simple for your information, your work, to really travel through the means outside of Jamaica, and for opportunities to now be available to us here. But also I think it's vital and important for us as artists to really give back to home, because that is where you were nurtured, where you were grown, and if you cannot do that, how do we expect the Jamaican art to really grow as much as it possibly can if we're just simply exporting it? And exporting ourselves and our practice. So for me, similar to you, I aim to be here forever. Jamaica is home, and I aim to travel as well. But here is where I think that my practice really serves the purpose in its biggest sense. Here's where I think the main impact is for me in terms of being able to really allow textiles, allow fiber to speak my truth, but also the truth of others, but also to become a medium that is embraced, understood, and accepted that as the traditional medium, such as painting, sculpture, etc.
Thank you very much, Katrina. Roberta, do you have a... I'm not pressing you.
Oh, no. I was just trying to do that. That's why I'm
Sure.
You asked in an earlier question, or floating some concepts about, who ultimately does the artist create for? And I would say, and I'm going to say what I'm thinking, and then I'm going to go back to a starting point. I would say that I create for the truth, insofar as I'm capable of understanding it, hopefully with the assistance of my environment, friends who will tell me, when I'm not, doing the best I can, or if my thinking is off. It's very good to keep an open mind in terms of what other people have to share. But I would say ultimately I create for God. And what does that mean? Because if there is truth, then there's this ultimate driving force for me, this need to dig and to go as deep as I can. And where does that come from? I'm not sure, but never to give up and to keep on trying and know that what I've done is not what I would have, really hoped for, because nothing ever ends up the way I really wanted it to. But because I believe that there is the individual pain, Then there is the community pain, past and present, and ultimately what can occur in the future, because there's so much inequity. We can only think of Jamaica 100 years from now and know that so much of the problems we have today may not be resolved. And then there is something, I think, beyond the us and the them. And that keeps me going. That I really, truly, I wouldn't say I believe it, because there isn't anything really to believe. I think that gets us into issues. And I'm not associated with any organized religion. It's just that if I hear something, I believe it to be true, I pay attention. You know, I give it my full attention as best I can. And, you know, there has to be a degree of radical faith and radical trust. So in my everyday life, you know, everything is falling apart, never enough funds to do the work I want to do. Am I going to be able to pay my mortgage? And then I think, but I can pay a mortgage. How fortunate am I? So there's that. But some other radical faith keeps me going, where, you know, I can be anxious about everything, but I keep going. So that's where I think the radical faith comes in, because I believe that, not so much that I was given any kind of gift or anything, I just believe I wasn't any better at drawing than my classmates. But there was just something that I wanted to keep going with and persevere, and I think perseverance has been most of it, if you ask me. So there is something always larger for me, and if it doesn't involve us, Laura mentioned in some of what she said, referring to healing, and to that I would add solutions, healing, mercy. I believe the heart of the universe is mercy, but we just don't see enough of it. And to work towards that goal, and if we don't as artists, then it will be us and them.
Thank you very much, Roberta. Now, we have, I think, about 10 minutes left, and I want to throw it open to the audience for questions, comments to the artists, rather than to me, hopefully. Is there a microphone by which the members of the audience can ask questions? Is there another microphone for the audience? Yes, of course.
Thank you so much for this panel. I've been really enjoying hearing your responses and helping me to think through the works that you've been doing. So I have actually two questions. One is for Katrina, and it's actually to ask if you could elaborate a bit on this point you were making about what sounds like nurturing spaces, and how you might think about the womb as a nurturing space and the state as a nurturing space. When you were talking about Jamaica being a space for production, right? For creating, maybe I'll say creation instead. So if you could maybe talk a bit more about spaces of nurturing, the very internal and then this external. And then there was a question I had, I think both for Laura and Roberta, if you could talk a little bit more about invisible loss in a different kind of way, loss in a connection to identity, and what I'm referring to is race. So Laura, you had mentioned in your earlier statements that you had a black great grandmother, and you said that whether I'm mixed, whether you can tell or not, right? Whether you can see it or not. So I'm just thinking about how is a certain invisible element of your identity playing out in the work, right? Or how is it that you might be seeing a part of your identity as invisible to the outside eye, and how is that playing out in your work? So if you could talk a bit about race for you, Roberta, and for Laura, and if you could talk about nurturing spaces, Katrina.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that question. All right. So for me, within my practice, within the medium of textiles and nurturing, the practice is really looking on the maternal figure, the maternal structure, and what that can be and how it exists in multiple different forms. That which is even first as a girl coming into womanhood, and that transitioning of seeing the first cycle. And then now this whole notion, the cultural notion of being the domestic or domesticated in some way, shape, or form within. As a girl, you take care of the home, you cook, you clean, there's a certain way you're expected to dress, take care of yourself, but also you are automatically even put in the role of nurturing everyone that's around you. And with that, as women, you automatically become the nurturer of society in some way, or your community, and culture. And I think with that, with my practice, the textiles and fiber, in different cultures, it becomes this parts of that rites of passage, becoming from a girl into an adulthood. You're taught how to weave, you're taught how to knit, you're taught how to really put together this medium that clothes you, that becomes your sense of identity within society. And just how this notion between this thing, this object that we cannot do without, becomes almost that reflective of the first thing that you're greeted with, which is the womb. You know, it is that which protects you within that first 9 months of engagement, and just reflecting within that, within the practice, within just creating an environment that which is nurturing, an environment that welcomes you in, but also an environment that rips you, an environment that puts you in turmoil almost, and figuring out how do we navigate constantly through that turmoil of what the woman is, the woman and the function of the body, in relation to how we navigate and negotiate amongst ourselves within society, and the positions that we take as women, whether within the working space, whether at the home or amongst your friends. Yeah.
Well, when I think of what's invisible, I mean, essentially, I don't feel that many of the things that happen to us should ever be perceived as bad, but what I think happens is the people we love the most, our families, our care, the people who have cared for us since birth, there are amputations. They are invisible amputations. And because of those amputations, we are not able to pass on to the people we love, our children, our children's children, we're not able to pass on a solid strength. I believe this to be a spiritual issue. When we deny a part of ourselves, we become weak. It is invisible, but it will manifest itself in certain, obviously, negative behaviors, addictions, mental illness, and how to love the very people that did their very best, but because of the communities into which they were born, where it was essential, if you were born in 1917, to repress, deny, and do your best to make as less visible as possible your blackness, your black heritage. If you were gay, you were completely silenced. You were to be silent and invisible at the same time. And everyone knows, well, I shouldn't say everyone knows, everyone who is gay knows that if you are trying to develop as a teenager, you're completely unable to, so you become, in a way, quite stunted. You're not able to bring your partner home to meet your family or the person you're seeing, and there's tremendous shame that you carry that is not yours to carry. It's the society, and it's misogyny, and it's hatred, or the hatred of homosexuals that makes it incredibly difficult for a person who's gay, no matter what home they're raised in, to feel okay about themselves. That ends up being, hopefully as an artist, translated more into a connected, how do I connect to other people's invisibility? Because if I think of people who are very poor, I imagine that they must feel that they don't matter. And this is heartbreaking. I mean, if one thinks about it, I could barely, sometimes can't watch. I do watch the news all the time, but I always say to myself, I can't watch that, but I watch it. And it's very painful. I'm not sure I'm really answering your question because I know it was really related to race. Of course, any amputation in my family pertaining to race has absolutely impacted me. My great-grandmother was black, and I began to notice things. So you start to ask questions, and referring to something David asked earlier about storytelling. No one wanted to tell any stories, The stories were repressed, they were hidden, they were invisible, and I had to dig for them and push for them and, be quite relentless in asking questions until eventually I would hear something like my grandmother telling me that in the neighbouring property to her in Westmoreland, there were 3 children and the youngest was 5 years old. He was a little boy and he was sent away first because he was darker. Eventually, if you push hard enough, you will get some stories. So anyway.
Okay, this must be better. Oh, race. I don't know what to say. I'm sort of gone speechless. I just operate from a place of, I feel like it's just coming, something's coming out of me and I'm on open channel and I have no control. And, when I did, I've done 3 canoe projects, and maybe by the time I'd done the 3rd one, I said, well, it must be over now. I must have expunged the demons or whatever, I don't know. But it just keeps coming out of me, and I feel like I have no control. Guide Thy Way Home was, when I was doing it, I was just like obsessed. I couldn't stop making hearts, we couldn't stop making plinths. The piece just came, and it was just getting bigger and bigger, and I had no control. So I don't know, it doesn't seem to matter what race you are, it's just something's inside of you and it's got to come out. The race factor is just, I'm born where I'm born, I am what I am. I can't change that. And I'm sorry if it offends others, or doesn't seem right that I do what I do. I can't help it. What else can I say?
Thank you very much, Laura. I'm told that this panel needs to be brought to an end, and that there will be a coffee break that follows, and then, of course, the second panel will take place. I want to take this opportunity to thank all of the artists here, Laura, Roberta, Katrina, Phillip, for sharing with us dimensions of their process. I think enormously important ideas have emerged around the artist as a vessel for various kinds of social forces, spiritual forces, creative forces, the question of responsibility, to whom, to oneself, to a larger community, the sense of art emerging from a womb I think the womb of creativity is an enormously provocative expression and something for us to take away and think about. The kinds of intervention that your work has made, and for reminding us of the question of Jamaica, the question of Jamaica's relationship to a wider world, and the kinds of, I don't know what else to call it, but the kind of critical realism that I see articulated in your work. Thank you guys very, very much, and thank you, the audience, for being here and for participating. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
evening, everyone. Welcome back to our panel discussion, Artists Under Pressure. This is part 2. This panel discussion is, of course, in support of our current Kingston Biennial themed Pressure. My name is O'Neil Lawrence, and I will be moderating this panel with these 3 artists here. To my far left, we have Nari Ward. We have in the middle, in the blue, we have Nadine Hall, and right beside me, we have Kaleb D'Aguilar. Now, David, in the first, for those of you who are here in person, David Scott, the lead curator of this exhibition, very ably introduced these conversations that we're about to have, so I'm not going to plow that ground, so to speak. And just for further reference, my name is O'Neil Lawrence. I am the chief curator here at the National Gallery of Jamaica and also co-curator of one of 4 co-curators of this exhibition. So without further ado, I'm just going to launch into my questions. They're not particularly stressful. All right, so for the first, and this is a question for all 3 of you, and feel free to answer it how it's most relatable. The exhibition was originally planned for 2019, as you all know, and then 2020, well, no, sorry, it was initiated in 2019, it was planned for 2020, and there were several delays. One of the hallmarks of the last few years, I think, has been change, and with that, I think about the proposals that initially came in and the work that eventually came into being that is displayed downstairs. What have the intervening years between the initial approach from the galleries, curators, and so on, transformed for you? And if not that, what has transformed for you in terms of your work and your general practice since the beginning of this process?
Oh, okay. Let me start. The work, excuse me. For me, the work was consistent. It has always been that installation. I think the hardest part of it was to be true to the narrative, since it was so heavy, and I didn't want, people were telling me that, I consulted one of my professors, and she was like, oh, I don't want to deal with that. Because she had obviously unresolved issues dealing with the topic that I was dealing with. And I wrestled. I was like, how do I tell the story but not necessarily labor the narrative on the audience? And so my artist statement took almost a year to articulate everything that I wanted to say. And and also the process of me evolving in my practice. So the work was the original work. The artist statement came through and I was able to say exactly what happened. And, but my practice, and I've now evolved from like an installation artist to a conceptual artist who works in installation, photography, and sculpture. And so that has been the change for me.
I think that in 2020, the work has always been about migration and how that has caused families to be displaced or broken up. But in 2020, I was interested in taking a more documentary style approach. I wanted to interview real families that dealt with this issue and real mothers and real children in Jamaica and real mothers in the UK or elsewhere in the diaspora. And the process of, in some ways, hunting down these participants was an introduction into the world of documentary filmmaking and proved that it was going to be a little bit more challenging than I expected. I knew so many friends and family members who had issues with this topic, but I realized it was going to be a much more personal and difficult conversation to have with the parents who decided to leave. And so during the process, I revamped the work and I said, okay, let me give that time and space to grow and develop in its own time, and let me take a little bit more of a filmic, metaphoric approach with this installation. But all the videos that you watch are still inspired by the real stories. So the time gave me, the 2 years, gave me time to at least start a process of interviewing and then changing the work in some ways. But then also gave me time to finish my master's in filmmaking and grow in my practice as a filmmaker. So, yeah.
So, for me, you know, the pandemic is as disastrous as it is. For artists, I think it was more of the same, of kind of going inward and being in your own space. In some ways, it may be even more so, because I didn't have to worry with deadlines or any other real responsibility, the routines that come up in everyday life. So when David approached me about what I would want to do for the biennial, even early on, it all starts for me anyways with the material. So the shoelace was a material, a very simple, sort of recognizable material that I knew I wanted to activate and trigger something that pretty much everybody knew. And it sort of brought me back to an earlier work that I did. I'll just talk a little bit about it. It was taking the preamble to the Constitution, We the People. And the reason I chose to take on that phrase, the American Constitution, the reason I chose to take on that phrase is because it was a project I was doing in Philadelphia with this organization called the Fabric Workshop. But it was also the sort of birthplace of the preamble to the Constitution. It was penned in Philadelphia. So just in terms of site specificity, it made sense. But the other aspect of it was that the phrase has sort of lost its meaning. I think a lot of people just kind of didn't think about it anymore, or they didn't really have any real regard. You know, it's like that, something that's in plain sight, but you don't really think about it because you just take it for granted. And I kind of felt like it in and of itself was being taken for granted. And the entire premise for it, the statement, I wanted to slow down to read and articulate, and actually also relating it to the body, the way the shoelace is related to the body, you know, tying shoes. I think it all sort of tied, it made sense to engage it with that very simple material. The thing that's also really important in experiencing the work, which is what I was thinking about also, is that at different spaces that you're looking at that material, you can lose sense of what it is. Its legibility changes based on the viewer's relationship to it. And so, again, David approached me and I said, you know, I want to do something that I'm always thinking about that I think a lot of myself and a lot of Jamaicans might take for granted, which is the national seal. And I just felt like it was something that I wanted to reappropriate and reanalyze and sort of basically reconfigure. So the banner is still pretty much consistent with that, but the two indigenous, so there's two indigenous, a couple, or they're Arawaks, and then there's the crocodile. And so there are all these layers of symbols that are connected to that. And I wanted to use the symbols and bring in another set of symbols that would contemporize it. And I think the entire premise is really, I think back then it was made to talk about a kind of harmony, maybe a fictional sense of harmony, right? Propaganda of unity. And I think it was also within the framework of Black Lives Matter protest, I think I really wanted to talk about the people part, like to really make it become about the people and not about this sort of fictional unity that it was founded in. And so the whole image, and basically it's a people power form with the horn, the maroon horn, being raised up. And so it was just that simple, just like taking that and recentering the conversation from being about a notion of, we all know, a notion of a kind of falsehood, to one of the premise for the future is the people and putting them first.
Thank you so much for that. As artists who are living and or working in the diaspora, do you feel a responsibility to articulate your Jamaican Caribbean identity within your practice? And if so, do you think that's a reasonable expectation? I like how Nadine's going first each time.
And so my work, all of my work comes from, mainly, it's autobiographic, from that personal space of navigating the landscapes of Jamaica in terms of socioeconomic, gender-based, and coming from this working class family and from a broken household, and how art was my way of escape. And so I bring that to the conversation, but it doesn't stop with me. It's a point of entry for these larger discourses that recur in society. And so when I went to University of Miami, I just completed my MFA in sculpture, that was what I had. I was not American. I didn't even know African American art and stuff until I started the courses. And I had a brilliant professor, Professor Erica Moya James. And so I did that. The work that I actually have downstairs was my first work, the first concept that I developed in the program, because I was leaving from Edna Manley dealing with heirlooms, and I talk about cycles. And I did the work celebrating my mother and her input in my life, being a dressmaker, and I saw that as a child and I wanted to be like her. And so I took on that mantle, because her craft is not seen, like being a dressmaker, just a domesticated dressmaker, it's not seen as an art, it's not seen as something that is valuable. She was not seen as beautiful or talented. And I saw that as a 5-year-old, 6-year-old growing up, and I said I wanted to be like her, but I wanted to elevate her gift and take it to an international level. I have succeeded. And I have succeeded, but the work, my narrative, it's not just about me. It's a familiar narrative. It's a familiar narrative about a familiar set of people who are pretty much invisible, and we come back to that from the first conversation. And so within my own family, still being invisible and these invisibilities. And so I brought forth these discourses. I did take on some of the American stuff because I was thrust into this conversation about race and racism, and I was like, oh geez, I don't know nothing about them something here. I don't know. Please don't get me mixed up in nothing. Jamaica may I come from. But they was like, no, all right, so I took on that. And then it was eating me up. And then I found a way of escape. I went back to my roots, come back to Jamaica, coconut cake, coconut drops on peanut cake. And I did my sculptures with that formula. And I did my MFA show, making bricks and blocks out of coconut cake and coconut drops and peanut cake formula that my mother taught me that her grandmother taught her. And I had to sell those at Excelsior High School to support myself. And that was my way of escape from carrying on legacies of teenage pregnancy and poverty. And so I took it with me and I ran with it. And it wasn't for the American, it was for the people in the diaspora who because we are there and we want signals, we want signs and pulses of hope, because it's a very oppressing system. It's 24 hours of trauma, non-stop. And so when we see these little pulses, we get like a fibrillator and we get a jolt and we're able to move on. So that was what the work did. And so I represented and I stayed the course. And so I'm glad to be back to share, the experience.
It is very funny to me to be considered an artist in the diaspora, and it's been told to me a few times in the past few months. Whereas, because I still think of myself as obviously Jamaican, but living here, but because I've had these experiences of being referred to as an artist in the diaspora now, it's caused me to reflect on that. And it's true in many ways, because my work is constantly kind of looking at the relationship between home and abroad, and where is home. And I assume that's because of my own experiences with traveling and being away from home in the last 3 years. And the work even going before that, because of my own experiences with family members, mother being abroad. And so what does that look like, and what is my own experiences? But what I find a bit interesting is that in the last 2-3 years, I'm exploring many different ideas of the diasporic or relationships in the diaspora. So whether that's because of the Windrush scandal, which is what my graduation film was about, or research into the migration of Jamaicans in the diaspora who have known Jamaica their whole life, young Jamaicans who, because of criminal offenses, they're also being deported to Jamaica. And then even with this work taught, looking at that relationship between people who leave Jamaica and the ones who are left behind. So, it's just been interesting that the last 3 years has been a constant investigation of home, which I never set out to do. I think similar to I think what you were saying, I never set out to do that. I never set out to explore these topics, but maybe there is something about being away from home and constantly searching for home where you are, and as an artist, as a creative, that coming out in the work.
Yeah, for me, that's a big question. I think it might take us back to the first question you had about the pandemic. And I think that the major shift for me, I think and I can probably, for me, it's a demarcation of a transformation. Because it's just in a way, a cathartic experience globally. I think what I recognized is that previous to that, and even thinking about that time of isolation, I was a Jamaican immigrant. Like, my moves abroad were, more with the notion of an immigrant of trying to do better than the next generation, and all the things that you would, these microaggressions of racism you ignore because they're happening to someone else. You just have to think about what's going to benefit you for this moment. And I think that stopped, or I shifted to start thinking more about the white supremacy and its pervasiveness and how it forms everything that we do. And I'm glad that I actually didn't enter that mind space as an immigrant because it would have been harder for me. I think I'd have been a much more angry person. So now wisdom has kind of taught me how to navigate it and how to navigate it within my work and in the art world in general. So I think that there's a whole body of work I did about, ethnicity and nationalism that I was trying to think about how I was negotiating it on a daily basis and how my children are negotiating it, identity, that is. And so I think it was really important for me to be an artist, to be able to find a vein to engage with those angst and anxiety. And now reflecting on it, it's actually kind of necessary to move forward with the awareness. So that, I don't know if I answer what you're asking, but it's kind of, because what you're talking about is really not necessarily something that one has control over, it's what's imposed on you. And I feel like you're also talking about that pervasive nature of white supremacy that individuals of black and white are navigating.
Thank you. And yes, you did answer the question. I am going to kind of move into something that's, another question that is coming a little bit of almost a segue from what you just articulated. And I'm going to use the word articulated again. We've been saying so many times throughout the narration of this exhibition how nuanced the concept of pressure is in Jamaica, in the Jamaican diaspora. But one thing that has come out, within the various articulations that we see downstairs, and this will relate to some of you, but not necessarily about your work. What's pervasive are the articulations of black pain, and of course the overarching effects of colonialism. It keeps coming back again and again in various ways within the works that we see downstairs. Why do you think that is? And not somewhat in your work, but from what you've seen so far in the exhibition, why do you think that those two things keep coming back again and again and again?
Okay. For me personally, these recurring symbols and narratives keep repeating themselves because I don't think the truth has been told, and so we are living this lie, and so it keeps popping up. The truth is, we won. We won, and especially with because my work doesn't deal with so much so the trauma or the legacies of slavery or trauma or rape. No, it's about the overcoming. That's more powerful. And we have always been told, oh, they were beaten, they were slaves. No, bitch, that was wrong. The correct thing is, they came under tremendous pressure and they survived. We ain't talking about the survival. We have been speaking from the slave master's perspective. We need to tell our own stories. And I'ma tell my story like I'ma tell it foreign with my coconut drops and peanut cake, because that was what they had. They used the resources. They were resilient. These were brilliant people. They created languages. And in order for you to create a language from a language that currently exists, you have to know it back and front and dissect it and then encode it so that the colonizers don't even understand. This is why what I got in my program. And it was just a self-introspection and looking at my life and my ancestry. Oh, and let me tell you that I am direct descendant of Paul Bogle. So I'm speaking with authority. My great-grandmother that inspired the work that I did for my MFA is Abby Hale Bogle from Trinityville, St. Thomas. And I am 5th generation Bogle. Yeah? And so the narrative, and we're bright people, Jamaica Wolf are bright people. Them just can't give me one scholarship to do my master's, and me go regurgitate and put massa upon one pedestal. It not gonna work, cause I'm bright. I'm gonna use it up. And that is what has been happening, the regurgitation of this defeat. Hell no. They got scraps to eat and they make stews and stuff. We get jerk chicken. And when I go for I tell people about the jerk chicken, how it came about. They say, oh, we didn't know. I said, no, the enslaved, they had to bury the stuff and cook it underground because the smoke would go up and they would be recaptured. Can we tell the stories? Can we stop this defeatist thing that, oh, these legacies answer? No, they won. They did the work with their bodies. They formulated ways of being and survival with their bodies and laid on them soul for us to get up now and still put mass up on a pedestal. Them are roll over in them grave. And so the shackles are loosed and the chair is empty and we're on the outside of that space looking in. I went into the MFA program and I took sugar, all the legacies of sugar and all the narratives of sugar, and I said, I'm gonna make sugar my bitch. They worked the sugar, them couldn't eat it. If them eat it, them get flogging, some of them died. They could not taste the very thing that they harvested, they cultivated. And I'm like, okay, we have this narrative. Oh, they were enslaved and they worked the plantations and plantation this. No. They won, we won, we won. And I took sugar and made building blocks because I was celebrating the building blocks of my narrative, of our survival. They laid down their souls thinking that one day they will get it. And I got it. And so why are we regurgitating this defeatist? No. We have music and our culture has influenced the world. Anywhere black people go, especially Jamaicans, because we are stars. We lead everything. Can we celebrate that? I use the peanut cake and the coconut drops on the peanut cake for the people who are peddling on the streets because we say we have no respect for the poor. We have no respect for the people in the inner cities. And we discard them. How much rich people they put up on pedestal because them go foreign university, them go foreign go work on the plantation. They don't come back and bring glory to Jamaica. Shelley and Yussi and all of them, where them come from? Banana grown? Wait, what that? Can we see what we have? Can we appreciate what we have? And can we stop regurgitating this lie about they were not able to tell their stories? We have the education, we have the truth, we have the resources, we have technology. Let us start telling our stories, how it was, how it is. And moving forward for the nation needs to be built up. We can't just hear the story about defeat. Black History Month had the worst time of the year for me. And it's this rage that they wanna, and this rage, and you can't, what you gonna do? It's already done and them go on and them promenade. And I was caught up in that rage when I said I took them on. And my professor, my dearest professor, Erica James, she said, let it go. And when I let it go, my work switched. And it was about my people and my ancestors and how they survived. I'm not looking on white people no more. I'm not looking on that no more. Yes, it happened. Yes. But the truth is, the blackest of them, black as midnight, they survived and they made a way for us to have this freedom that we have. What will I do with the education and the degrees and the PhDs and something? What will I do with it? Sit down and complain again and four legs and say, oh. I had to, based on my circumstances, I had to figure out life on my own. I'm not blame my mother, the circumstances. she had a rough life. I don't know what my granny life was like, but my mother had that, and what she had, she gave, which was trauma. How can we fix these cycles? It's fixable if we start talking the truth. Sorry.
No.
Yeah, thank you. That's, you know, the thing that's difficult is knowing the truth, or knowing the sets of truth, because history is complicated and layered and sedimentary. And I teach in university, so and this is something I always try to tell my students, because they'll come to information and it's raw, urgent, and they want to express it. And the problem is they don't make room for other imaginations. And that's the work of the artist, right? So you have this energy, this anger, this story to tell, and you have to figure out the poetics that will allow for another set of experiences to be to live in it, and that generosity to do that is what you're talking about, trying to figure out how to take the anger and make it into a vessel for accommodating, but also transforming. Because when that person comes in, the viewer, they have to know, hopefully, if you make something strong enough and determined enough and manifest enough, they have to change their change their expectation for it. They have to build another kind of story for themselves. And that's, you're giving them a tool to construct. And I think that's the beginning of, without imagination, nothing changes. And I think that's what we are setting up. That's what your work is, as a sculptor, as an art maker, as a community builder, is really to make place for the imagination. And then you use materials of history. And I think that's the thing, right? The history is something that is complicated. It's wrought with lies and power, play of power over controlling people's expectations and, you know, their normal everyday experience. And I think that's taking that dialogue with history and telling that other story, and that even the story you tell is not the complete story, right? And there's all these layers, but that you can tell that story in a way that that person's going to remember it, and it's going to affect them, and that when they leave the space, they may see something in life, in the street, or in their everyday experience that's going to echo back to a dialogue with that moment that they had in the gallery or museum or contemporary space. And that's already a shift. And that's already another kind of information they're adding to the thing they're now experiencing in the world. So I feel like that's what you're getting at, O'Neill, is also how do you affect, or how do you want to affect people outside, right? After they see your work. I don't want to just affect them when they're in front of the work. I want to figure out how that experience that they had just had is going to manifest maybe an hour later, or maybe a month or a year later. And how that's going to have them come to a different kind of reckoning with the thing that maybe they wouldn't have looked at before, or maybe they wouldn't have even considered, because now we built a building block of imagination for them to engage with. I think that's what I see here in the line. I mean, I love that we're here together, the three artists, because a lot of the work in the show resonated with me. But the one common theme in all of our work is this idea of the line, just the line, the string, and this idea of weaving, and I feel like the line doing more than it's expected to do, right? Is so the line telling a story is kind of endemic to all of us, you know. And that story is an open story for the viewer, for their story, you know, connecting to their story, the line as a connection. So anyway.
Just to touch back on the point of black pain and colonialism, I think that a lot of that's evident in the work in the exhibition because we are also connected to Jamaica as artists in Jamaica or in the diaspora. We were talking about in the earlier panel how connected we are on a global scale. And so although issues around Black pain is often talked about as a highly racialized topic, obviously, and one that's in America, when I think of work here, I often don't think about it from that lens because I've grown up here where the majority of us are Black, and there is a kind of relationship with Blackness that is a little bit more nuanced. However, because of globalization and a lot of American influence, the last 10 years, we've, or at least for me, I've had to be thinking about myself as a Black person in ways that I never did before. And maybe that's also because of age, and maybe that's also because I'm now in the diaspora. But I just found it interesting that you asked that question, and also in thinking about bringing it back to my work, I guess there's a way in which I'm a little bit more interested in the micro relationships, but I don't think, and the pain that is evident in these relationships, but that can also be obviously connected back to colonialism, capitalism, issues around identity and nationalism. And so in a lot of ways, I do think that Black pain is evident in the work, but I'm thinking about if that's Black pain as a socio-racial topic, or is that pain that Black people are just simply under, and the Black people in Jamaica. You know what I mean? And I think that there is a difference in those two distinctions.
All right, thank you very, very much. This is the connected thread and line in this panel is absolutely amazing. I am now instead going to open up for questions from the audience. Microphone's coming.
Good morning. Well, thank you for engaging us in this wonderful conversation. My name is Gillian Rowlands. I'm in human resources and I'm a writer. So people are what I'm about. And I wanted to revisit your theme of we the people. The first time I kind of understood this business about people being put into boxes because of race was when I went to America. And they asked me to fill in this thing, Hispanic, Black, this, that, and I couldn't find my box. I put PE, and they said, what's that? I said, I'm a polyethnic. And I'm a declared polyethnic because I'm a mixture of Black, Indian, I have Scottish, I have Japanese, I'm a mixture. And I have been questioning this issue of the reductionist view we have of race, where we want to define race, and you've spoken about it. It's often couched in the pain and the victimization and so on. But I happen to live in Africa for 4.5 years, where Black Africans don't have the same perspective on race as American Blacks and Caribbean Blacks. They're Black. They belong to a continent. They know who they are. They define themselves by their tribe. I went to India. They're the caste. What caste do you belong to? Are you this or you that? I went to Europe. The first time I saw poor white people was in Europe. So I've asked myself, what is race? Is it a nationality? Is it a socio-economic position? Is it a political position? What is it, and who sold us this reductionist view? I think we have perpetuated some of what the colonial masters gave us, but we can't keep on living in their conflict, as you said. It is also perpetuated in different ways. And also, I think we have to be aware that in every society, there is inequality. The richest people in my life that I saw were in Africa. And it's not all a utopia where everything is perfect and everybody is, there are inequalities there. In India, of course, we're grappling with that whole business. I say we, that's the DNA from India speaking, of caste. So when are we going to start to define ourselves in different terms? And you spoke about the heroic in us. I, for one, am tired of just hearing about all the victimization we went through, and we keep selling this to our children when we are a powerful people. And we now have to define that. We have to bring it out. We have to talk about our histories. We have to talk about our polyethnicity as well. Because I think if you scratch all of us here, we're going to find out we ain't that pure anything. And I just want us to go back to people, right? We want to define ourselves as black people, pink people, yellow people. What about people? And I don't know if you could expound a bit more on we the people, because that's what I want to hear, I think, coming out of a dialogue now.
You know, I'm not sure I can expand on it, but the question of, you know, race is where it's coming from. In a sense, it's really coming from the need for race to evolve was really put into sort of hyperdrive by that sort of a capitalist enterprise, right? It was really about making slaves and making profit. And we're still navigating that now on different levels, our interaction with capitalism and its own pervasiveness. So that the idea that the people, that, I mean, getting back to the term then, that we the people, it was always really, for me, a strange term because I know that it was made when a good amount of the people of color, weren't really considered the people. So that was another thing to think about, and what you talk about survival, you know, that we have, black people have come so far, and are still here and still telling our stories. I don't think it's necessarily, and I think it can get overbearing, you're right, and I used to be the same way. I used to say, I don't want to hear that anymore. But I've changed my position to wanting to listen so I can understand what's different about that story based on other similar story. Because there's so many nuances of the story that I don't get bored anymore or get frustrated anymore with hearing it over and over. When I do listen to it, I try to listen for something new that I didn't get before. And that's not even that I didn't get it, it's that I've learned. Something has happened inside of me that I've gotten something, I've seen something that was there before that I've grown to recognize. So that sense of recognizing, I think, is really kind of, maybe that's kind of what I'm trying to think about as an artist, like recognizing these different moments so that they can be brought to the forefront, so that they can have a different atmosphere around them, a different kind of energy around them. Anyway, I don't know, yeah.
Answered.
But the one thing I do want to say, you know, that text, and that's not to, the text is a very strange text, the We the People text, because at one point I decided I wanted to make it in Arabic, right? Because in fact it was actually, what really inspired me to take on the text was that it was a calligraphic text, right? And so I said, well, and I was curious as to what it would look like in this material, this lace material, this kind of doubling of the line. And so when I tried to put it in Arabic translation, it never worked because they don't really have a phrase for we the people. It really is, if you broke it down to their translation, it's we are the people, which is really interesting. So that was a kind of an awakening moment for me in terms of the special nature of that expectation or the aspiration for that text.
Thank you, Kaleb, Nadine, and Nari. Is this on? Yeah. I'm not entirely sure how to formulate my question, but one of the threads that seems to be emerging from what I hear the three of you saying turns in some way around how to shift not only the nature of the artistic production of objects, but the ways in which the object encourages a different narrative perspective from which to appreciate what is produced. And it's articulated perhaps very directly in talking about, in refusing the narrative of the victim. And the question that I want to ask the three of you is whether or to what extent what needs to be transformed is the object or its audience.
Oh, I'm gonna jump in. Boy. Oh, definitely the audience. The audience. Even in this setting, like even the cab that I was coming in this morning, I was like, oh, driver, I have an exhibition, and you can come in. I said, them something they are going, I wouldn't know about it. I wouldn't hear about it. And there's a kind of contempt again for a certain class in Jamaica that they don't know and they don't care. And that is so wrong. And so, yeah, that's the answer.
You spoke about the creation of your own work in relation to this. And I imagine that Kaleb and Nari think about this as well. How do you create objects such as to enable the transformation of the perspective from which an audience thinks about its collective history? Because that's what I hear you urging here. And one can see that in what Nari is talking about in terms of the foregrounding of a different way of imagining the national emblem, or Kaleb talking about in terms of the re-narrativization of the story of migration. How does an artist think about what needs to be transformed in the production of work that aims in some way to stimulate a different perspective from which a common past is talked about?
I think I did that with my MFA work, with the sugar sculptures, the coconut drops and peanut cake, that the people that these are things that they use. We see them every day. And the said people that my work is geared towards saying, hey, there's a way of reimagining this thing and making it into something else. And that transformative nature of that. It's the urge of reimagination, rethinking, revisiting. And that was what I was able to accomplish with that MFA work, and it was specific because I wanted to include these people in the conversation. And said, Magana find me, I represent Uno because I come from you. I was there. Then them called me Dropsy at Excelsior High School. 2016, I went to Marcus Steele's office because I got a scholarship from them, from Careers, and his executive secretary was in the grade below me at Excelsior, and I used to sell her the coconut drops. And the first thing she said, Dropsy, and I had to bear that stigma, and it still stung, and I was like, but I have a degree now, and I said that. I was like, yeah, I'm just finish Edna money, I'm gonna get my degree, just to kind of pacify that sting. And so for me, it's using this familiar and the mundane and the everyday, and then bringing it into this high art space or this accepted space where it designates value And I'm saying that you are valuable because I see myself in you. And I was there, I am there. I know the business of coconut drops. I know it through and through till I make even one of tools them for dehusk the coconuts. And so that is my response to your question, David.
I think that it's the role of the artist to reimagine the object, and in reimagining the object, the hope is that you can help to change or shift the perspective of the audience. I don't think as artists that we have full control over the audience. And I think in my work, yeah, like starting with migration, and my aim was hoping that the audience would see grace or look on both parties, but in some ways more specifically the parents who leave mothers with a lot more grace. And I use that with the barrel, but because it's, I guess, a more iconic figure that we all know. But I was really using it or trying to use it with the cords that connected mothers to their sons, whether that's the rope or telephone cords or this kind of metaphysical internet, cords. So how are they connected, and asking the question, is that umbilical cord stretched too thin with distance? And then also, utilizing those cords in somewhat real life situations, and showing these women as is in natural environment, and leaving space and breath for, with the hope that the audience could imagine, could see them as real people trying to give their children a better life and their families a better life. So, yeah, using the object to make the audience think in new ways.
One quick question. So what happens to the object when, for instance, in Jamaican art, the object represented is always from a specific demographic? So if you look right around the room, right at the top, it's one set of Jamaicans being represented. And when one group of Jamaicans who are represented as the aesthetic of the culture, and that gets moved into upper middle class homes in Jamaica, that nobody in that circle represents any of these people. So you have another sort of aesthetic migration from one demographic into another. The cycle seems to start over again, at least from a theoretical perspective. How do you deal with that?
I don't know how I deal with it, but I do think what we're also talking about is this level of abstraction. Even when you have something figurative, there is a level of abstraction that I think about, a level of abstraction in how to, or I also use the word poetics interchangeably, in how to reconfigure the viewer's expectation for it. And I think that, like what we're saying is, I think what you're bringing up, Phillip, is, how when it enters this marketplace or even the institution, how is it being read and how is it being absorbed? And I don't know if you can entirely control all that. I think you have to do what you want you can do and what you need to do and what the work, how the work leads you, and think about what rooms are left for other people to engage with it.
I am going to, unfortunately, have to let that be the last word, because I have been furiously signaled for some time that we are supposed to be coming to an end. For the audience who is here, you will still have an opportunity to speak to the artist. They're not running away. And I would like to invite all of you who are watching online to please make your way down to the National Gallery for the kind of exhibition that has generated these two very, very interesting panel discussions. It is Pressure. It's running until December 31st. Please join us when you can. It has an exceptional catalog as well. I'm doing the commercial. Of course, I work here. So thank you very much for joining us for these two panels, and please enjoy the rest of your day.